In the winter of 1944, the Allied powers had already landed in southern Italy and were pushing north. It became obvious the Axis were losing the war. It was only a matter of time. They wouldn't go without a fight, however. The Allies wanted to take Rome, with one of the obstacles on their way being the Archabbey of Monte Cassino. This giant building on top of a hill was to be taken by them. What they didn't expect was the fierce resistance by the Germans protecting these lines. It would take the Allies 4 incredibly deadly and disastrous planned assaults for them to finally overtake the Archabbey, or, well, whatever rubble was left of it. It was one of the deadliest series of assaults by the Allies on the Italian front during the Second World War. As the end of 1943 was approaching, the German forces stationed in Italy had been pushed back by the Allied powers. They now meant the so-called Gustav Defense Line, which ran from the Garigliano River on the west coast along the Rapido, just south of Pescara. It was a fortified and excellent line of defensive positions, and it proved strong enough to prevent the Allies from reaching Rome. The entire network was held by General von Wiettinghoff's 10th Army. Well, in the middle of this Gustav Line was an enormous chunk of rock. Its name was Monte Cassino, and it stood 520 meters above the town. On top of this rock, the ancient Benedictine monastery looked over the Liri Valley and the road to Rome, which was only 120 kilometers away. The Abbey of Monte Cassino had been founded in the 6th century, and due to its central location throughout the centuries, it had been destroyed and rebuilt 4 times. Now, I haven't visited the largest archabbey in the world, Monte Cassino, but I did visit the second largest one in Pannonhalma. If that sounds interesting to you, consider checking out that video after this one. I'll link it in the description. The US 5th Army under the command of Lieutenant General Mark Clark was approaching Monte Cassino from the south. The strategy they had agreed upon was to attempt to outflank the Gustav Line with an amphibious assault at Anzio, which lay behind the German lines, while launching an assault on Monte Cassino from the south at the same time. The mission was diligently planned, and the Allied powers expected much resistance from the Abbey on the hill. Now, the ironic thing was that the Germans had not placed troops inside the monastery. Its local corps commander, General Frido von Senger und Etterlin, was a lay member of the Benedictine order. He had explicitly forbidden any armed troops from being stationed in the monastery. General von Senger had instead ordered the German defenses to position themselves, concealed in the crags and re-entrance of the mountain. Over there, the men of the elite 1st Parachute Division dug in, awaiting the Allied assault on Monte Cassino. On January 17, 1944, General Clark ordered the launch of the attacks on Monte Cassino. The troops on the Allied side truly were a mixed bunch. There was the American 5th Army, the British 8th Army, and these were supplemented with French colonial troops, Canadians, New Zealanders, Poles, South Africans, and even Gurkhas and Rajputana from India. And so the assault commenced. It was rather quickly repelled by the dug-in Germans that sent down a barrage of fire on the approaching Allied troops. Over 3 weeks of heavy fighting and many casualties later, on February 12, the Allied powers had been forced to call off their attack. The closest they got was the US 34th Division, which managed to approach Monte Cassino within a few hundred yards. Eventually, this division too was repelled by the Germans. While the Allied powers launched their attacks on the south of Monte Cassino, at Anzio the force that was supposed to outflank the Germans had landed. In reality, that really was it. They landed, but they didn't advance. They immediately were trapped on the beaches and came under heavy fire, unable to break out. The Allied forces were in desperate need for reinforcements, and General Clark requested those from his superior General Sir Harold Alexander. General Alexander was convinced the Germans had manned the Abbey in Monte Cassino and figured the only way to root them out was to call in air support and bomb the building. Clark protested, and many people protested this controversial move, but the order was given anyway. General Alexander issued a warning to the monks inside the monastery that they should leave together with the priceless art treasures believed to still be in the Abbey. The Allies did not yet know the Germans had evacuated nearly all the monks and looted all the art treasures over 3 months before the battle even commenced. The morning of February 15 was marked by an Allied airstrike on the Abbey. American bombers laid large parts of the buildings in ruins. An eyewitness later reminisced. There was a flash, as might be expected from a giant striking gigantic matches on the hillside. Then a pillar of smoke about 150 meters high hid the hill and monastery from view. It was curiously beautiful, curiously sinister. Aside from the fact that most of the beautiful ancient Abbey was laid in ruins, it was a complete strategic error of the Allies. The Germans were dug in on the slopes of the hill after all. The Abbey wasn't manned and wasn't much use either when it was intact. After the Allied bombing, the Germans could now man the craters and hide behind the piles of rubble, which made the hill even more difficult to siege for the Allies. The Germans dug in on top of the hill right after the bombing, when the Allies were anticipating a quick assault following the airstrike. They were still unsure whether the strategic bombing could be considered strategic at all. In a sense, the Allies shot themselves in the foot by bombing the Abbey. Under the command of General Sir Bernard Freyberg, the 2nd New Zealand and 4th Indian Divisions now launched their assault on the German paratroops, fortified among the rubble. They did manage to break through, however. Once again they came close. During the cold night of February 16, a battalion of Royal Sussex Regiment stormed Mount Calvario, a bit to the north of Cassino. The company failed to overtake the German paratroopers and they suffered 50% casualties. The day before, the Royal Sussex Regiment was at the forefront of another assault as well, sustaining many casualties. In these 2 days, they lost 12 out of 15 officers and 162 out of 313 men. It was a bloody and hopeless battle for the Allied soldiers. After another attack by the Rajputana was beaten off, General Freyberg ordered the Allied attacks to cease. For nearly a month, battle plans were mapped out and new plans were devised. On March 15, they would try once again. During that night, once again, American bombers bombed the remains of Monte Cassino, a heavier bombardment than before. Unfortunately for the Allies, the German positions now enjoyed even deeper bunkers and tunnels, supported with rubble. Now, Freyberg's divisions attacked again. Thanks to the lunar light, it was difficult for the artillery to support the infantry, desperately attempting to penetrate Monte Cassino. On the front line, New Zealanders Rajputana and Gurkhas fought hand-to-hand combat. The ominously named Hangman's Hill, on which they fought, as well as Monte Cassino, remained in German hands. General Freyberg was forced to call off the attacks on the 23rd. His troops had sustained an incredible amount of casualties, 3,000 men from the Indian Division and over 1,500 men from the New Zealand Division. Regardless of the enormous amount of casualties already suffered, the Allies immediately began devising new battle plans. It was crucial they broke through the Gustav Line and take Monte Cassino. General Alexander decided they would deceive the Germans, convince the German Field Marshal Kesselring in Italy that another amphibious landing behind enemy lines was going to take place. The goal was to convince him that his path of retreat would be cut off if he didn't relocate German forces. Alexander's real plan was to crush the defenders of the hill with numerical superiority and firepower. Field Marshal Kesselring considered the Allies had around 6 divisions facing the 4 divisions dug in on Monte Cassino. In fact, there were 13. The deception had certainly worked, and these 13 divisions were spread along a 32-kilometer wide front. It stretched from the mountains north of Cassino all the way to the sea. General Alphonse Juin proposed to Alexander that his French North African troops would be able to find a way through the mountains. After all, they were used to the conditions of the Atlas Mountains. On May 11th, these North African troops managed to find a way through, and subsequently the attack, codenamed Diadem, commenced. Before we get to the battle at Cassino, it is worth looking at Juin's troops. These 9,000 Goumiers, whose equipment was carried by 4,000 mules, managed to infiltrate the 3,000-meter-high Arunsi Mountains on the south of Cassino. They would 3 days later outflank the Germans, much to their surprise. The terrain they crossed was considered impossible to traverse. Now, the main assault on Cassino was spearheaded by 50,000 men from Polish General Władysław Anders. This general, with an utterly unusual and fascinating life story, which I will tell more about at the end of this video, commanded his forces on the morning of May 12th, towards the German strongpoints. Under a barrage from fire and shelling over open ground, they stormed Monte Cassino. It took 5 days of fighting, with thousands of casualties, and when on the 14th the Goumiers outflanked the German defences, the Polish soldiers were still bravely launching their attacks on the Germans. It was on the 18th that the battlefield fell eerily quiet. When a troop of scouting lancers went to investigate, they found a few Germans that were too gravely injured to continue resisting. Whatever was left of the monastery on top of the hill was abandoned. The group of scouting lancers now produced a Red Cross flag and planted it among the smoking and burning rubble on top of the hill. It took the Allied powers 4 months and over 50,000 casualties, but they managed to finally take Monte Cassino. The road to Rome now lay open to them. The Germans had lost around 20,000 men, many of whom were buried in anonymous mass graves. That is, if their bodies even were recovered. And that is the conclusion of one of the costliest series of Allied offensives on the Italian front during the Second World War. Now, before I mention the story of Władysław Anders, it is a very interesting one. He began his military career in the Imperial Russian Army, which fell after the revolutions of 1917 and subsequent civil war. In 1939, after the Red Army had invaded Poland, he was captured and spent 2 years in a Moscow prison. Released in order to form a Polish military force after the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa, he managed to travel to the Western powers via the Middle East. After the Second World War, he became a very prominent Polish politician of the Polish government in exile. He opposed the Soviet Union and its yoke over Poland. I'll consider writing a video about him, as his story is extremely fascinating. If you'd like that, let me know your thoughts in a comment. And thank you for watching this video. I would also like to thank all my patrons for their generous support. If you enjoy House of History and want to support my work, consider checking me out on Patreon. For just $1 a month, you will gain access to the exclusive Patreon series. If there is a person or event from the Second World War you would like to know more about, let me know your thoughts in a comment. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.